She cooked the most magnificent wedding feast anyone in Wyoming had ever tasted, and the bride made sure no one would ever know her name. For 6 weeks, Martha Holloway poured everything she had into a celebration that wasn't hers. She stirred, she baked, she bled her knuckles raw over cast iron pots, while a woman with pearl earrings and a cruel smile erased her from every room she entered. But here's what Vivian Ashford never understood about women like Martha. You can hide someone behind a kitchen door, you can steal her work, you can mock her in front of 200 people, but you cannot make invisible what was never meant to stay hidden. If you're watching this from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, because this one's going to stay with you. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday, which Martha always thought was the cruelest day of the week for bad news. Mondays you expected trouble. Wednesdays you were too tired to feel it fully. But Tuesday had a particular kind of meanness to it, arriving just when you'd started to think the week might hold together after all. She read it standing at the kitchen window, still wearing her flour-dusted apron, her coffee going cold on the counter beside her. The numbers weren't complicated. She owed $412 in back payments on the farm loan. The bank would begin foreclosure proceedings in 60 days if the balance was not cleared. The letter was signed by a Mr. Gerald Pruitt, First Wyoming Territorial Bank, and it was polite in the way that instruments of destruction often are. Martha set the letter down on the table. Outside, through the warped glass of the window, her 40 acres stretched out toward the tree line in the pale November light. She'd lived on this land for 11 years. She'd buried her husband, Daniel, under the big cottonwood near the creek 4 years ago. A November burial, as it happened, the ground barely soft enough to dig. She'd planted the kitchen garden herself, stone by stone, clearing the west field, learning which soil held water and which drained too fast. The farmhouse needed a new roof on the east side, and the barn door had been sticking since August, but it was hers, or it was supposed to be. $412. She was 43 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that were more capable than pretty. She'd always been large, what her mother called sturdy, and what the world had always called something less generous. She'd made her peace with her body the same way she'd made her peace with most things. Slowly, imperfectly, and with a fair amount of private grief along the way. She made ends meet cooking for the county fair, for church socials, occasionally for wealthy families passing through who needed a capable woman for a dinner party. She had a reputation, she knew that. People talked about Martha Holloway's cooking the way they talked about a good summer, with a kind of reverence mixed with relief, as if they hadn't expected the world to offer something so genuinely fine. But a reputation didn't clear a banknote. She was still standing at the window, letter in hand, when her neighbor Bess Cartwright came up the porch steps without knocking, the way she'd been doing for 7 years. "You look like someone died," Bess said, hanging her coat on the hook by the door. "No one died." Martha folded the letter carefully, as if the neatness of the fold might contain the damage. "Bank's calling the loan." Bess was small and quick, with sharp eyes that missed almost nothing. She sat down at the kitchen table without being invited and pushed Martha's cold coffee aside. "How much?" $412. "By when?" 60 days. Bess was quiet for a moment. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post near the garden and stayed there, turning its head with that particular bird intelligence that always unsettled Martha slightly. "I heard something yesterday," Bess said finally, "from Dottie Pierce over in Clearwater. She said Caleb Thornton's getting married." Martha glanced at her. "Caleb Thornton from the Double T?" "The very one. Young woman from back east, apparently. Philadelphia, the Ashford family." Bess paused, the way she always did before delivering the part that mattered. "Dottie said he's looking for someone to cook the wedding feast. 6 weeks of preparation, a full celebration meal for upward of 200 guests. She said he's willing to pay real money for someone who knows what they're doing." Martha looked at the folded letter on the table. "How much money?" she asked. Dottie didn't know for certain, but she said he turned down Clara Webb, and Clara Webb charges more than anyone in the county. Martha knew Clara Webb's cooking, technically correct, utterly without soul. The kind of food that filled a plate and left you vaguely disappointed. "I don't know Caleb Thornton," Martha said. "You know his land. The Double T's the biggest spread in the territory. He's a serious man. Quiet, from what people say. Not flashy. His father built the ranch. He kept it running. He's never been the type to throw money around for show. Bess leaned forward. Martha, if it's real money, it might be the money. Martha looked out the window again. The crow was gone. I'd have to write to him, she said. I brought paper, Bess said, and pulled a folded sheet from her coat pocket with the satisfied expression of a woman who had planned this conversation from the beginning. The reply came 5 days later, faster than she'd expected. The handwriting was plain and even, without ornamentation, the writing of a man who had no patience for flourish. Mrs. Holloway, your reputation has been mentioned to me by 3 separate people in this county, which I take as sufficient recommendation. The position involves full preparation of the wedding feast for approximately 200 guests to take place on December 14th. Accommodations will be provided at the ranch for the duration. Compensation is $500, payable in full upon completion. If this arrangement is acceptable, please arrive at the Double T no later than November 3rd. Caleb Thornton, $500. Martha read the number twice. It was almost $100 more than she owed the bank. It was more money than she'd earned in the previous 8 months combined. It was, in the most practical terms, the difference between staying and losing. She wrote back the same afternoon. Mr. Thornton, the arrangement is acceptable. I will arrive November 3rd. Martha Holloway. She arrived at the Double T on a gray morning with a trunk of her own knives. 3 cookbooks she'd annotated so heavily they were more her words than the original author's, and a carpet bag of personal things. The ranch was larger than she'd imagined. A main house of pale timber and river stone, a long bunkhouse to the east, barns and outbuildings spreading back toward the foothills like something that had grown rather than been built. A ranch hand named Hector met her wagon at the gate and helped carry her trunk to the kitchen entrance. Not the front door, she noticed, but the side entrance near the woodpile. She told herself it didn't matter. She was the cook. The kitchen door made practical sense. The kitchen itself was a revelation. Wide and well-equipped, with a cast-iron range large enough to cook for an army, 2 long preparation tables, and a pantry that ran half the length of the back wall. Copper pots hung from ceiling hooks. There was a separate cold room off the back. The space had been designed by someone who understood cooking, or at least understood what cooking required. Martha set down her bag and stood in the middle of the room and felt for the first time in weeks something adjacent to hope. You must be the cook. The voice came from the doorway behind her. Martha turned. The woman standing there was, by any conventional measure, beautiful. Tall, fair-skinned, with dark hair arranged with the kind of precision that required both a maid and considerable personal vanity. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool that had clearly been made in a city, and she held herself with the unconscious authority of someone who had never in her life been asked to wait. Vivian Ashford, the woman said. She didn't offer her hand. I'm the bride. Martha Holloway, Martha said. I'm the cook. Something moved across Vivian Ashford's face. A quick assessment, the kind that categorized and filed in a single glance. Martha knew that look. She'd been receiving versions of it her entire life. It started at her face, moved down to register the width of her shoulders and hips, and returned with a conclusion already formed. Yes, Vivian said, as if confirming a suspicion. Well, Caleb mentioned you come highly recommended. I try to do good work. I'm sure you do. Vivian moved into the kitchen with the particular ease of a woman inspecting something she already owns. She ran one finger along the edge of the preparation table, examined it for dust, found none. I want to be clear about expectations from the beginning, Mrs. Holloway. This wedding is very important to my family. The guest list includes several prominent families from Wyoming and 2 from Colorado. The evening must be perfect. I understand. There will be certain standards. Vivian turned to face her directly. When guests are present in the main house or on the grounds, I'd prefer that kitchen staff remain in the kitchen. It's simply a matter of maintaining the proper atmosphere for the occasion. Martha held very still. Of course. The wedding party itself will require several fitting events and rehearsals over the coming weeks. I'd appreciate discretion during those times as well. The kitchen entrance, she gestured vaguely toward the side door, should be the primary access point for all staff. All staff. As if there were others. As if Martha were part of a category rather than a person. I'll need access to speak with whoever manages the pantry supplies, Martha said. Her voice was level. She'd learned, over many years, to make her voice level when other things were not. Speak with Hector. He handles procurement. Vivian moved toward the doorway. One more thing. The menus will be my decisions, naturally. I'll let you know what we'll be serving. Martha had been planning menus since she was 19 years old. She had opinions about food the way some people have opinions about justice, deeply, from somewhere foundational. It would help, she said carefully, if I could offer some suggestions. I know what's available in the territory and what travels well for a large event. Vivian smiled. It was a thin, practiced smile, the kind deployed when patience is actually its opposite. I appreciate that, Mrs. Holloway, but I have a very clear vision for the evening. She paused. I'll bring my notes tomorrow. She left without closing the door behind her. Martha stood in the kitchen alone, listening to the sound of the wind coming under the eaves, the creak of the ranch house settling. She thought about the bank letter, 60 days, $412. The cottonwood near the creek where Daniel was buried, how it looked in November with no leaves, all gray bone against the sky. $500. She went to the pantry to take stock of what was there. She met Caleb Thornton the following morning at 4:30. She hadn't expected to meet anyone. She'd come downstairs in the dark hours because she couldn't sleep. The unfamiliar sounds of a strange house, the different quality of silence on a large ranch. And she wanted to get a proper sense of the range on the big stove before she began cooking in earnest. She was standing at the counter with a candle, reviewing her notes, when the kitchen door opened and a man came in from outside, stamping mud from his boots. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the kind of build that comes from actual labor rather than intention. Broad through the shoulders, lean otherwise, with calloused hands and a face that had spent a great deal of time in wind and weather. He was perhaps 45, with dark hair going gray at the temples. He looked at her with dark eyes that showed surprise but not alarm. "You're the cook," he said. "And you're the rancher," she said. He almost smiled. It was barely visible, just a slight change at one corner of his mouth, but it was there. Caleb Thornton. He moved to the stove with the familiarity of a man who had spent considerable time in this room and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd set on earlier. "I come down before the hands get up. Didn't know you'd be awake." "I'm usually up early. I like to have the lay of things before a day starts." He nodded, looking at her notes on the counter, not reading them, just acknowledging their existence, the fact of preparation. "Bess Cartwright's the one who told you about the position?" Bess passed along the word. "You know her? Her late husband sold me a quarter horse 6 years ago. Good animal." He leaned against the counter with his coffee, and there was nothing performative about it, no effort to impress or establish himself. He just leaned there the way people lean when they're tired and comfortable. "You drove from Clearwater alone?" "I did." "Long drive." "I've made longer." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "My ranch foreman tells me you make a biscuit that men have considered proposing over." She laughed before she could help it, a real laugh, not the polite kind. "Your foreman is flattering me for access to the kitchen." "Probably," Caleb agreed. "Can I ask you something?" "You can try." "What are you planning to feed 200 people on December 14th? And that was the beginning of it. Not romantic, not significant in any way she could have identified in the moment. Just a man who was genuinely curious about the answer, leaning against a counter in the dark hours before dawn, asking a real question and meaning it. She told him. She talked about the roasted meats and which cuts were best for a crowd, about the challenges of timing when the kitchen was serving that volume, about what she'd been thinking for the bread courses and the desserts. She talked about the pickled vegetables she wanted to start that week, the flavors that needed time to develop. He listened the way people rarely listened, without preparing his response while she spoke, without looking past her to something else. He asked good questions, not impressive questions designed to show knowledge, but genuine ones that came from not knowing and wanting to understand. They talked for nearly an hour. When the sky began to lighten outside the kitchen window, he set down his cup and pushed off from the counter. "I should go," he said. "The horses won't wait." "No," she agreed. "They don't." He paused at the door. "Miss Ashford prefers... She's mentioned that the kitchen staff should... She told me." Something passed over his face. Not embarrassment exactly, something more complicated than that. a kind of unhappy awareness. "I'm sorry for it," he said. It was simple and direct and didn't have excuses wrapped around it. Martha nodded once. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Thornton. Thank you for the conversation, Mrs. Holloway." He went out into the gray dawn, and Martha stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen, and then she went to work. The notes arrived that afternoon, delivered by Vivian's personal maid, a young girl named Penny, who had the watchful, careful demeanor of someone accustomed to managing volatile situations. Martha read them at the preparation table. The menu Vivian had designed was ambitious in the way that things designed by people without practical knowledge are often ambitious. Spectacular on paper, nearly impossible to execute for 200 people without either a brigade of professional French chefs or a miracle. 12 courses, 4 separate entree options, 3 soup courses, an ice sculpture centerpiece that would require daily maintenance in a Wyoming December, imported chocolates from Denver for the dessert service. Martha set the notes down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She picked up her pen and wrote a careful, specific response outlining which elements were achievable, which were achievable with modification, and which were, with the deepest respect, genuinely impractical given the venue, the season, and the available resources in the territory. She offered alternatives for each impractical item that maintained the spirit of elegance while actually being possible to execute. She sent the response back with Penny. Vivian arrived in the kitchen 40 minutes later. "You've completely disregarded my vision," she said. She was holding Martha's notes, and she was not, Martha noticed, genuinely angry. She was performing anger, which was its own particular thing and sometimes more dangerous than the real kind. "I've tried to honor your vision while making sure the execution serves you well," Martha said. "A 12-course meal for 200 guests requires—" "I didn't ask for your professional opinion on the limitations of this kitchen." "No," Martha said. "But you hired someone with experience in feeding large numbers, and part of that experience is knowing what's possible." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. "You're quite direct for someone in your position." Martha kept her hands flat on the preparation table. "Would you prefer I wasn't honest with you about what I can deliver?" The silence stretched between them. "The chocolate from Denver," Vivian said finally. "You said it was impractical. The roads in December are unpredictable. If there's a late snow and the supply wagon is delayed, you'll have guests and no dessert. I can make a chocolate confection that will be better than anything you'd import, using what I can source reliably within a 2-day ride." "Better," Vivian repeated with a slight emphasis that made the word sound foolish. "I believe so," Martha said quietly. "Yes." Another silence. "We'll keep 8 courses," Vivian said, "not 12. She set down the notes as if releasing something she'd rather have kept. "The rest, we'll discuss." She left. Martha let out a slow breath and reached for her pen. 8 courses was something she could work with. The weeks developed their own rhythm. Martha was in the kitchen before dawn every morning, working through the preparations that required time. The stocks that simmered for 18 hours, the pickled things that needed weeks to become themselves, the candied fruits that required daily attention. She'd hired 2 local women to help with basic preparation. Frances, who was steady and efficient, and young Clara, who was eager in ways that occasionally created more work than they resolved, but who was learning fast. The mornings before the household woke were hers, and she valued them the way she valued solitude in general, not because she disliked people, but because solitude was where she did her best thinking. Most mornings, Caleb Thornton came in around 4:30, poured his coffee, and stayed for a while. She hadn't expected it to become a habit, but it did. They talked about practical things, mostly. The quality of the beef he was planning to butcher for the feast. Whether the root cellar temperature was adequate for the preserves. He'd mentioned once, almost in passing, that his mother had kept a large kitchen garden and that he'd spent his boyhood in the kitchen more than most ranch boys, helping shell beans and learning to distinguish wild herbs by smell. It explained, she thought, both his comfort in the kitchen and the intelligence of his questions about food. He asked her once about the farm in Clearwater. 40 acres, she said without preamble. Northwest corner has good soil. The rest is more work than it looks. You work it alone? I manage it. I hire when I need to for the heavy seasons. Your husband, Bess mentioned he passed. 4 years ago, November. She didn't stop the prep work while she talked. Her hands continued on the vegetables in front of her. Fever. He was sick for 8 days and then he was gone. She paused. He was a good man, not a perfect one, but genuinely good. Caleb was quiet for a moment. My father died 3 years ago. He built this ranch from a homestead claim, 160 acres to nearly 4,000. He looked at his coffee. I've been trying to be a good steward of it. It shows, Martha said, and meant it. She could tell a great deal about a person from their kitchen, and Caleb's kitchen, well-maintained, intelligently stocked, the tools cared for without being precious, told her about someone who valued competence and durability over display. The ranch isn't the only reason for the marriage, he said one morning, out of what seemed like nowhere. Martha didn't respond immediately. She continued rolling out the pastry in front of her. You don't have to tell me that, she said. I know. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The Ashfords have land that adjoins mine to the southeast. The marriage consolidates certain arrangements. Business, Martha said. Business, he agreed. She looked up at him then, briefly. His expression was the expression of someone who has said something true that they wished were different. Is that enough? She asked. She wasn't sure why she asked it. It was not, strictly speaking, her business. I don't know, he said honestly. I keep thinking it should be. She went back to the pastry. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the dark blue of a Wyoming dawn breaking into something paler. My mother used to say, Martha said, that you could put excellent ingredients together wrong and still end up with something that didn't nourish anyone. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Your mother was a cook? One of the best I ever knew, Martha said. He set his cup down. I should go. The horses won't wait, she said, which had become, without either of them deciding it, a kind of standing acknowledgement, a way of marking the end of the morning hour before the rest of the day arrived. He went out, and Martha stood for a moment with flour on her hands, and then got back to work. As the wedding date approached and the guest list began to materialize into actual people, advance riders, a family from Laramie who arrived 2 weeks early, Vivian's mother and 2 sisters who descended with opinions about everything, Vivian's instructions regarding Martha grew more specific. If guests are walking near the kitchen building, please ensure the doors are kept shut, Penny relayed one morning, reading from a handwritten list. Miss Ashford prefers that the meal preparation remain behind the scenes, for the atmosphere. Martha said nothing. Also, Miss Ashford's mother has requested that the kitchen staff not be present during the decorating of the main hall. That's fine, Martha said. I have no need to be in the main hall. And Penny hesitated. Miss Ashford would like the kitchen staff to wear plain dark dresses during the service itself. Nothing that might draw attention. Martha looked at the girl. Penny looked back with the careful expression of a messenger who knows the message is unkind and has no power over it. Tell Miss Ashford the kitchen staff will wear what is appropriate and clean, Martha said. Penny left quickly. Frances, who had been pretending to be absorbed in the stock pot, turned around. She knows you're not a tablecloth, right? You can't just make someone invisible because you want to. She can try, Martha said. She went back to her work. But that evening, after the kitchen was cleaned and the fires banked and Frances and Clara had gone home for the night, Martha sat at the preparation table with a cup of tea and did not pick up her notes or her cookbooks. She thought about what it cost to be invisible. Not the effort of it. She understood that part. The constant management of yourself. The careful neutrality, the work of making sure no reaction showed on your face. She knew that work well. She'd been doing it since she was a girl, large in a world that preferred women to be small in every sense of the word. The question was what it cost over time, what it extracted from a person to spend years managing their own visibility for the comfort of people who hadn't earned the right to be comfortable at her expense. She thought about the farm, the cottonwood, the 40 acres. She thought about the $500. She drank her tea and went to bed and got up the next morning before 4 and started the fires. 3 weeks before the wedding, Caleb came to the kitchen one morning with a cut on his right hand that was still bleeding. Fence wire, he said when she looked at it. Stupid. I know better. Sit down, she said, and went for the cloth she kept for burns. She cleaned the cut at the kitchen table while he sat with the patience of a man accustomed to minor injuries and unaccustomed to being tended to. She could feel the tension in his hand, not from pain, she thought, but from something else. The Ashfords are talking about the land agreement again, he said. Is that your business to tell me? Probably not. He looked at the cut while she worked. Vivian's father wants it in writing before the ceremony. I keep asking for more time to review the terms. Martha said nothing. It's 180 acres, he said. Good grazing land. It was my grandfather's claim originally before my father bought it back from a neighbor. My father spent 6 years buying it back. She finished with the cut and wrapped it simply and efficiently. There, she said. He looked at the wrapping. Thank you. What do you want to do about the land? She asked. It was a bold question. She knew it was bold the moment it left her mouth. He was quiet for a long moment. Keep it, he said. Then keep it, she said simply. It's not... He stopped. The terms of the arrangement are complicated. Most arrangements are, she said. The question is usually whether what you're giving up is worth what you're getting. He looked at her steadily. In the kitchen light, with the fire going and the early dark still outside the windows, his face was very clear. He looked, she thought, like a man who was tired of pretending a decision was more complicated than it actually was. I should go, he said. The horses won't wait, he finished quietly. But he didn't move immediately. He sat at the table for another moment, looking at the wrapped hand, and then he stood and went out into the dark. Martha stood alone in the kitchen and felt the specific ache of something she hadn't allowed herself to name. Outside, the wind came down from the mountains the way it did in late November, and the kitchen walls held against it, and Martha put her hands to work. The final week before the wedding arrived like a train that's been expected but still moves faster than you planned for. Every day was organized pandemonium, deliveries arriving at the kitchen door, the cold room filling up, Francis and Clara working long hours while Martha coordinated everything from the center of the kitchen like a general who has studied the terrain and knows exactly where the danger is. The food was, she knew, extraordinary. She knew it the way a craftsperson knows their best work, not with vanity, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has given everything they have to a thing and can feel the difference. The roasted meats were perfect. The bread was better than anything she'd made in years, something having come together in the combination of the high altitude and the particular flour Hector had sourced from a mill in Laramie. The desserts were, well, the desserts were the best work of her life. She thought about that sometimes in the quiet moments, that her finest work was being made for a celebration she hadn't been invited to attend, that the greatest feast she'd ever created would be served by others, eaten by strangers, and attributed to no one who'd actually made it. On the evening of December 13th, the night before the wedding, Vivian came to the kitchen. It was late. The kitchen was clean, the preparations as complete as they could be until the morning. Martha was reviewing her timing charts by candlelight when Vivian entered. She was dressed for an evening gathering, beautiful and composed. She looked at the kitchen, at the organized counters, the prepared things covered in their cloths, the evidence of weeks of labor, with an expression Martha couldn't immediately read. Everything is ready? Vivian asked. Everything is ready? Martha said. Vivian moved to the center of the kitchen, looking around as if taking stock of territory. You've worked very hard, she said finally. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd offered in 6 weeks, and it arrived with something uncomfortable underneath it. Not warmth exactly, something more like the feeling of a transaction completing. It's what I was hired to do, Martha said. Yes. Vivian's eyes moved to Martha's face. I want you to know, my mother and the guests will not know who prepared the meal. It will simply be the feast, the presentation. That's how these things are done, in the circles we move in. The staff remains background. Martha looked at her. I understand, she said. Good. Vivian turned toward the door. The morning service for the kitchen staff will be in here. The main event begins at 4 in the afternoon. You'll manage service from the kitchen. Yes, Martha said. Vivian paused at the doorway. For just a moment, something shifted in her expression, something complicated that Martha couldn't fully read. Then it closed again, and Vivian was composed and correct and already somewhere else. Thank you, Mrs. Holloway, she said, and left. Martha sat alone in the kitchen with her timing charts and her candle, and the fire in the range ticked softly as it cooled, and outside the Wyoming night was enormous and cold and full of stars that no one had bothered to name. She thought about the 40 acres. She thought about the bank letter. She thought about a man with dark eyes who came to the kitchen before dawn and asked real questions and listened to the answers. She folded her timing charts carefully, tucked them under the candle, and went to bed. Tomorrow, she would cook the greatest meal of her life, and no one would know her name. She was up at 3. Not because the alarm she'd set, a small clock borrowed from Hector, had gone off, but because her body knew. 6 weeks of early mornings had recalibrated something deep, and now waking before dawn wasn't an effort. It was just what her body did, the same way it breathed. The kitchen was cold when she came downstairs. She'd banked the fires the night before, but not enough, and her breath showed in the dark air. She got the range going first, feeding it carefully the way you feed something that needs to be trusted, then moved through the kitchen with a candle, checking everything she'd prepared the night before. The covered trays, the wrapped meats hanging in the cold room, the bread doughs that had been rising overnight in the warmest corner near the back wall. Everything was where she'd left it. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Frances arrived at 4:30 with her coat still buttoned, her hair not entirely pinned, looking like someone who had sacrificed sleep in the service of something they believed in. Clara came 15 minutes later, younger and more awake, with that particular energy of people who haven't yet learned that big days are exhausting before they're exciting. "Tell me what you need," Frances said, washing her hands at the basin. "Start the second range," Martha said. "Clara, the bread? I'll show you what to look for. If the surface doesn't feel right, you come get me immediately. You don't guess." "Yes, ma'am." They worked. That was the only way to describe it. There was no conversation that wasn't about the food, no movement that wasn't directed towards something necessary. Martha moved through the kitchen the way water moves through a channel, finding the path of least resistance toward the goal. She was not elegant about it. She bumped into the edge of the preparation table at one point hard enough to bruise her hip, and she swore under her breath and kept moving. She misjudged the heat on the back burner and had to pull the first batch of pastry shells before they burned, losing maybe a quarter of them. She stood looking at the damaged ones for exactly 3 seconds, calculated whether she had enough to compensate, determined that she did, and moved on. This was the part of cooking that no one talked about when they praised a meal, the physical toll of it. The kitchen was hot and loud, and the work was relentless, and her feet would ache for 2 days after this. But none of that was relevant because the food didn't care about her comfort. The food only cared about the food. At 6 in the morning, Caleb came through the kitchen door. She'd half expected him not to. Today of all days, the morning of his wedding, she'd thought the habit might break, that he'd have other demands on his time, other rituals for a day this large. But he came in the same way he always did, stamping the cold from his boots, moving to the coffee pot with the familiarity of a man in a room he knows well. He looked at the kitchen, the organized chaos of it, the 3 women moving through it, the smells that were already filling the air, and something in his expression was hard to read. "You're already deep into it," he said. "We've been at it since 3, Martha said, not stopping what she was doing. "The roasts need to go in within the hour." He poured his coffee and stood back, out of the way, watching. He didn't try to talk to her about anything real. He seemed to understand that this morning was different, that the kitchen was running at a pitch that didn't have room for the kind of conversation they'd built over the previous weeks. But he also didn't leave immediately. He stood with his coffee and watched the work, and Martha was aware of him the way she was aware of the temperature in the room, not thinking about it directly, but knowing it was there. After a while he said quietly, so only she could hear, "How are you doing?" She glanced at him. He was looking at her with the direct, unperformed attention that she'd come to know as specifically his. "I'm fine," she said. "Martha." She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her first name. He seemed to realize it a half second after she did, and neither of them addressed it directly. "I'm tired," she said honestly, "and I have a long day in front of me, but the food is going to be right." She met his eyes for a moment. "It's going to be better than right." He nodded slowly. "I know it will." There was a pause that had weight to it. "The Ashford family arrived last night," he said. "Vivian's father wants to speak with me this morning about the land papers." "Are you going to sign them?" He looked at his coffee. "I don't know yet." She wanted to say something. She felt it, the shape of words that were honest and probably not her place to speak. She thought about what she'd told him weeks ago, about ingredients put together wrong, and about what she hadn't said but had meant. that you could spend your whole life in a kitchen that didn't fit you and never make anything that truly fed anyone. She didn't say it again. He was a grown man who understood his own situation better than she did. It wasn't her life. "You should eat something before it gets busy," she said instead, and cut him a piece of the test bread she'd pulled 20 minutes ago. The trial loaf, not for guests, just to check the crumb. She set it on the counter beside him without ceremony. He picked it up and ate it standing there, and something in his face changed while he ate, a kind of involuntary response to something genuinely good. He looked at the bread and then at her. "I said this once before," he said, "about the biscuits, but this is... Martha, this is extraordinary." She turned back to the range. "I know," she said, which made him laugh, a real laugh, quiet and surprised. He finished the bread and set down his cup. "I should go." "The horses," she said. "Today it's not horses," he said. "Today it's a wedding." He said it flatly, without inflection, the way you state a fact you haven't entirely made your peace with. And then he went out, and the kitchen door closed behind him, and Martha stood for one moment with her hands still and her eyes on the closed door. Then Frances called out that the stock was ready for the next stage, and Martha went back to work. The morning moved fast after that. The way time always moved differently in a kitchen under pressures. Not slower, the way people sometimes said when they meant peaceful, but faster, compressed, each hour arriving before the last one felt complete. The roasts went in. The bread came out perfect this time, filling the kitchen with a smell so good that Clara actually stopped moving for a second just to breathe it in. Martha let her have that moment and then pointed her back toward the vegetable station. Around 9 in the morning, Penny appeared at the kitchen door. She had the expression she always wore when carrying messages she didn't enjoy delivering. A careful blankness, like a wall someone had painted over to cover something they didn't want seen. "Miss Ashford asks that the kitchen remain quiet during the ceremony preparation," Penny said. "She'll be in the main hall for the next 2 hours with her family and the dressmaker, and she finds strong cooking smells can be distracting." Martha looked at Penny for a moment. "We're roasting meat for 200 people," she said. "I can't stop the cooking smells." Penny's carefully blank expression flickered. "I know, Mrs. Holloway, I'm just telling me what you were asked to tell me," Martha said. "I know. Tell Miss Ashford the kitchen staff will be as quiet as possible." Penny left, and Frances turned from the stove with an expression that said a great many things she wasn't going to say out loud. "Don't," Martha said. "I'm not saying anything," Frances said. "I know what you're not saying." Frances turned back to the stove. The truth was that the request, the insult, which was what it actually was, dressed in the language of preference, landed in Martha the same place all the others had landed over the past 6 weeks. The same place the kitchen door landing had, and the dark plain dresses instruction, and the all-staff phrasing, and the dozens of smaller moments that each individually could be explained away, but together formed a pattern as clear as print. She had been handling it by moving it somewhere below the work, below the daily requirement of keeping her hands busy and her mind on the food. She was good at that. She'd had practice. But it was accumulating somewhere. She could feel it accumulating, the way a cold can sit in your chest for days before it becomes something you can no longer pretend isn't there. She went to the cold room to check on the desserts and stood for a moment in the quiet cold, letting it settle her. The desserts were lined up on the shelves with the particular dignity of things that had taken a long time to become themselves. The chocolate confections she'd promised would be better than anything imported. The fruit tarts with their pastry so flaky it almost hurt to look at. The spiced custards that she'd made 4 test batches of before she was satisfied. She looked at them and thought, no one is going to know I made these. And then she thought, they're going to eat them, and they're going to remember them, and the memory is going to stay with them even after the name is forgotten. The work persists. That's what her mother had taught her. The work persists past the person who made it. She wasn't sure if that was comforting or terrible. Probably both. She went back into the kitchen. By noon, the pace had become something close to violent. The kitchen was at full heat, every burner occupied, the smells layered and complex. Roasted meat, caramelized onions, fresh bread, the warm sweetness of the desserts beginning to be plated. Martha was everywhere at once, or felt like it, moving between stations, tasting, adjusting, catching Clara before she over-seasoned the sauce, and redirecting without raising her voice. There was no room for raised voices. Raised voices broke the concentration, and broken concentration showed up on the plate. It was during this stretch, this hard, hot, concentrated hour, that she heard voices from the hallway beyond the kitchen door. She didn't register them at first because her whole attention was on the timing, but then the voices rose, and one of them was Caleb's, and the other was a man she didn't know, and what was being said pushed through the noise of the kitchen and reached her despite herself. The papers need to be signed before the ceremony, Caleb. That was the agreement. The agreement was that we'd discuss terms before I signed anything. We have discussed them. This is beyond discussion. Your father's verbal commitment to my father was— My father is dead, Edmund. A verbal commitment he made 20 years ago to a man I've never met is not a document I'm signing this morning. A silence. Vivian is your wife in 6 hours. I'm aware of that. Then act like a man who understands what that means for this family. Another silence. Longer. Martha was not moving. Frances was not moving. Clara had gone entirely still at the vegetable station, holding a knife above a carrot, not cutting. I'll speak with you after the ceremony, Caleb said. His voice was controlled, but there was something under it like the sound a river makes when the water level is too high. Right now I have a wedding to prepare for, and I'm not signing land papers in my kitchen hallway. Footsteps, a door, then quiet, except for the sound of the fires. Martha looked at Frances. Frances looked at Martha. Neither said anything. Clara slowly resumed cutting the carrot. Martha went back to the roasts. She turned them the way they needed to be turned, and she checked the temperature, and she focused on the food, because the food was what she could control. The food was what was hers. The afternoon came down like a curtain. By 2 o'clock, the kitchen had reached a kind of focused intensity that Martha recognized as the good kind of pressure. The kind that clarified rather than confused, where every movement had its reason and the reasons all connected to the thing being built. She could see it taking shape, the whole of it. The way a meal for 200 people is actually many small meals happening simultaneously, each component timing dependent on the others, and she was holding all of it in her head like a map of something very large that she'd spent weeks learning to read. At 2:30, Penny came in again. This time her expression was different. Not the careful blankness of delivered messages, but something closer to genuine discomfort. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Martha with eyes that were doing more than relaying information. Miss Ashford would like the serving dishes to be arranged by her mother before service, Penny said. She's asked that the kitchen staff remain in the kitchen once the dishes are prepared. The serving will be managed by the house staff. Martha set down the ladle she was holding. This was new. The serving. She hadn't arranged for the serving. She'd assumed, because it was reasonable to assume, that she would oversee the plating and service from the kitchen, directing the timing, ensuring each course went out correctly. That was the work. That was the last and most critical part of the work, when 6 weeks of preparation either succeeded or fell apart. Penny, she said carefully, who's going to manage the timing of service if I'm confined to the kitchen? Penny's mouth pressed together. Miss Ashford's mother will direct the house staff. Miss Ashford's mother has never run a service for 200 people. I know, Penny said. And then quietly, from somewhere that wasn't the message, I know, Mrs. Holloway. I'm sorry. Martha looked at her for a moment. Penny looked back, and what was in her face was genuine. The apology was genuine. The discomfort was genuine. She was a young girl doing a job that sometimes required her to be the instrument of unkindness she hadn't chosen. Tell Miss Ashford I'll arrange everything for service before the first course goes out, Martha said. I'll prepare detailed instructions for the house staff. She kept her voice even. But if anything goes wrong with the timing, I'm going to need someone to come get me. The food can't wait for people who don't know how to read when a sauce is breaking. Penny nodded quickly and left. Frances turned from the stove. Martha. I know, Martha said. This isn't— I know. Frances looked at her with the expression of a woman who has seen injustice handled by people stronger than herself and knows there's a limit to what can be absorbed before something breaks. How much more of this are you going to take? Martha thought about the bank letter, the $412, the 60-day deadline, the farm with its 40 acres and its cottonwood near the creek. Long enough, she said. She picked up the ladle and went back to the pot. But something had shifted. She could feel it, not in the kitchen, where everything was still precise and controlled, But somewhere underneath, in the part of herself she'd been filing things away for 6 weeks, the place where she'd put Vivian's assessments and the kitchen door and the dark plain dresses and all the small precise humiliations that had each individually been manageable, that place was getting full. She didn't examine it directly. She didn't have time. The feast was 3 hours away and the food needed everything she had, and she gave it everything she had, holding the other thing down with the discipline of someone who knows that some reckonings have to wait until the work is done. The work came first. It always had. Outside, through the small, high window above the cold room door, she could see the sky beginning to move toward the particular gold of a Wyoming afternoon in December. Short days that burned bright for a few hours before the dark came down early and complete. She could hear, distantly, the sounds of guests arriving, carriages and horses, voices carrying on the cold air. 200 people, coming to eat her food, coming to eat food that no one was going to put her name on. She tasted the sauce, adjusted it, and called to Clara to begin warming the serving dishes. 3 hours. She could hold it together for 3 more hours. She was almost sure of it. The first course went out at 4:15. Martha had written the timing instructions in the clearest hand she could manage. Each course, the temperature requirements, the signals to watch for, the order of plates. She'd spent 20 minutes with the 3 house staff members who would be carrying dishes, walking them through it the way you walk someone through terrain they've never crossed. One of them, a young man named Robert, who couldn't have been more than 20, kept nodding with the focused expression of someone who understood they were being trusted with something fragile. "If anything looks wrong when you get to the table," she told him, "you don't improvise. You come back here." "Yes, ma'am." The sauce on the fish course has to go on at the last possible moment before it reaches the guest, not in the kitchen, at the table, or just outside the door. If it sits, it separates. "Yes, ma'am." "And if Mrs. Ashford, Vivian's mother, tells you to do something different from what I've written here, you come back here and tell me before you do it." Robert looked at her with eyes that understood more than his nod suggested. "Yes, ma'am," he said, for the 3rd time, and she believed him. She sent the first course out and stood at the kitchen door listening. For a moment there was nothing, just the sound of movement and voices at a distance, the particular murmur of 200 people settling into an occasion. Then, faintly, the sound changed. The murmur lifted slightly, the way sound does when something unexpected and pleasant interrupts the expected rhythm of a gathering. Frances appeared at her elbow. "They like it." "They haven't tasted anything yet," Martha said. "They like the look of it," Frances said. "That counts." Martha went back to the kitchen. The second course went out at 4:40, the third at 5:10. Each time Robert came back with the empty plates, and each time his face told her what she needed to know before he said anything. The slight brightness in his eyes, the way he moved with more confidence each trip, as if the reception he was witnessing was giving him something too. "The man at the head table," Robert said, coming back with the soup course dishes. "The big one from Laramie. He asked where the cook trained." "What did you tell him?" "I didn't know what to tell him. I said I'd find out." "Tell him Wyoming," Martha said. "Tell him she trained in Wyoming." He went back out. The kitchen was running clean. Not perfectly. The back burner on the secondary range was running hotter than she'd calibrated for, and she'd had to pull the 3rd bread service earlier than planned and compensate with extra warmth from the main range. Clara had fumbled a plate that hadn't broken but had required quick replating, and they'd lost about 3 minutes there. But these were the ordinary errors of a large service, the kind that happened every time and that you managed without letting them become the story. The story was the food. The food was holding. It was during the 4th course, the roasted beef, the centerpiece of the meal, the thing she'd been planning the longest, that she heard the door from the main hall open, and Vivian's mother, Eugenia Ashford, came into the kitchen. Eugenia Ashford was a woman who had perfected the particular art of being imperious without being loud about it. She was small and very upright, dressed in silk the color of old ivory, and she moved through the kitchen with the careful distance of someone walking through a place they consider beneath them, but are too well bred to say so directly. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, "the guests are asking about the roast. My daughter tells me it's your primary course." "It goes out in 12 minutes, Martha said, without stopping what she was doing. "The resting time is critical. If it goes out early, the texture won't be right. Several of the guests are quite hungry." "They'll be hungrier for 12 minutes, and then they'll eat the best roast they've had in years," Martha said. I need those 12 minutes. Eugenia Ashford looked at her with an expression that suggested she was unaccustomed to being told to wait by anyone, let alone by a woman in an apron. My daughter has suggested that the presentation might be enhanced by Mrs. Ashford. Martha set down the basting brush and turned to face her directly. She kept her voice level and her hands still, but she did not make herself smaller. She was done making herself smaller, at least in her kitchen, at least over the food. I have been preparing this meal for 6 weeks. I know what it needs. I need 12 more minutes, and I need this kitchen clear of anyone who isn't helping with service. I say that with respect. The last 3 words were a lie, or at least not entirely true, but they were the words that made the rest of them acceptable. Eugenia Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back through the door to the main hall without another word. Frances, from the stove, said nothing, but her shoulders moved in a way that was almost a laugh. 12 minutes later, the roast went out. She knew it was right the moment Robert came back. He was trying not to grin and failing. "Ma'am," he said, "the man from Laramie stood up." Stood up? From his chair to look at the platter. He stood up and looked at it and said something to the man next to him, and then they both... He stopped, shook his head. "People are talking, ma'am." The whole room went kind of quiet when the platters came out. Martha stood with the basting brush in her hand and felt something move through her that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. The work. The work was doing what she'd built it to do. "Good," she said. "Get back out there. The sauce needs to go on table side." "Yes, ma'am." The meal moved through its courses. The fish, which had worried her most because of the timing constraints, arrived at the tables at exactly the temperature it needed to be. The bread course drew its own particular response. Robert reported that a woman at one of the side tables had asked if she could have the recipe, which was, he said, apparently not something people usually asked about bread. The desserts were last, and Martha had saved something for them. A final element she'd decided on only 4 days ago, a decision made not from the original menu plan, but from instinct. She'd preserved the last of the autumn pears from the cold room in a spiced syrup of her own devising, something with cardamom and a touch of something sharper that balanced the sweetness, and she'd nestled them alongside the chocolate confections on each plate in a way that was, she knew, beautiful. Not in the way things are beautiful when someone has tried to make them beautiful. Beautiful in the way things are when they're exactly what they need to be. Robert came back from the dessert service with his eyes bright and his usual careful composure entirely gone. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, people are..." He stopped and started again. "Miss Ashford's mother sent me back here to ask who is responsible for the pears." Martha looked at him. "She sent you to ask that?" "Yes, ma'am. She said she's never tasted anything like them, and she wanted to know." Something complicated moved through Martha. She stood with that information for a moment, feeling it. "Tell her the cook," she said finally. "Tell her the cook is responsible." Robert opened his mouth, closed it, then, "Should I give her your name, ma'am?" "No," Martha said. "Just tell her the cook." He went back out. Frances came to stand beside her at the preparation table. They stood together for a moment, not talking, listening to the distant sound of 200 people eating a meal that one woman had made with her hands over 6 weeks in a kitchen where she'd been told to stay invisible. "You should be proud," Frances said. "I am," Martha said. "And I'm tired. And I'd like to sit down for 20 minutes, which I can't do yet." "No," Frances agreed. "Not yet." The service wound down over the next hour. Dishes came back. Coffee was prepared and sent out in urns that Robert managed on a cart, with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that hot liquid in formal occasions required particular respect. Clara cleaned as they went, which Martha had trained her to do from the first week. The kitchen cleaned continuously during service, not after, so that the space remained workable and the end of the night wasn't a catastrophe. It was around 7 o'clock. The dessert service complete, the coffee going, the kitchen in the managed wreckage of a successful large service, that they heard it begin. A voice, rising above the general murmur from the main hall. Vivian's voice. Martha was at the cleaning basin with her back to the hallway door, and she heard it through the wall. Not clearly at first, just the tone of it. The particular carrying quality of Vivian's voice when she was performing for an audience rather than simply speaking. Then the door to the hallway opened slightly, pushed by movement, not by anyone specifically, and the words became clear. Absolutely everything was my direction, of course. The menu, the presentation, all of it. I have very specific ideas about entertaining, and I knew from the beginning exactly what I wanted. The cook simply executed my vision. A murmur of admiring response. The pears, particularly, that was entirely my idea. I'd had something similar in Philadelphia, and I thought, well, we can do this in Wyoming. Why not? Martha set down the dish she was holding. She did it carefully. She set it down on the edge of the basin and she turned around, and Frances was looking at her from across the kitchen with an expression that was not surprise. Frances had been anticipating something like this for weeks, but was instead a kind of sorrowful acknowledgement. The voice continued from the main hall. I do think presentation is so important, don't you? And the challenge, of course, is finding help that can execute properly. One has to be very specific in one's instructions. The woman I hired had a certain raw capability, of course. A slight pause, the kind that was not actually a pause, but a breath taken for effect. Though one does have to work within certain limitations. When one is using local help, laughter. Polite, social laughter. The kind that wasn't about anything funny, but was about belonging to the right side of a distinction. Martha was very still. Local help, she said quietly. She wasn't talking to Frances. She wasn't talking to anyone. Martha, Frances said. She's telling them I'm limited, Martha said, still quietly. 200 people just ate the best meal most of them have ever had, and she's telling them the person who made it is limited. She's taking credit for 6 weeks of my work, in front of everyone in that room. Martha's voice was still level, but something under it had changed, the way the surface of a river looks the same right before it reaches a falls. She couldn't boil an egg without burning the pot. She tried to put 12 courses on the menu for a December ranch wedding because she doesn't know the difference between ambition and logistics. She removed me from service, from my own service, and gave instructions to people who didn't understand what they were handling. She stopped. And now she's telling 200 people that the pears were her idea. Frances said nothing. From the main hall, Vivian's voice again, lighter now, moving on to something else. The moment of self-congratulation complete and folded away into the larger fabric of the evening. Martha stood in the kitchen with her hands at her sides and looked at the door. She thought about what it would take to walk through it, to walk into that room and say, in front of all those people, what was true, what her name was, what she had made, what the past 6 weeks had actually cost her. She thought about the $500. She thought about it precisely and clearly. She had not been paid yet. Payment was upon completion, which meant she had not technically completed the arrangement. She needed that money. She needed every dollar of it. She turned back to the basin. She picked up the dish she'd set down and finished washing it. Frances watched her do it without speaking, and Clara, who had gone very still by the vegetable station, quietly went back to what she'd been doing. But something had changed in the kitchen's atmosphere. Something had broken, some quality of managed equilibrium that had been holding by discipline and necessity for 6 weeks. Martha could feel it in herself the way you can feel the cold come in before a window is fully open. It was coming. She didn't know exactly what form it would take. She only knew it was coming. She was drying the last of the large platters when the main hall door opened and Vivian came through it. She was flushed with the success of the evening. It showed in her color, the particular brightness of someone who has been admired for several hours and has absorbed it like warmth. She was still in her wedding dress, ivory silk with Brussels lace at the collar, and she was, objectively, very beautiful. Martha registered this the way she registered most things about Vivian by this point, accurately and without particular feeling. The evening has been a tremendous success, Vivian said. She looked around the kitchen with the proprietary air she'd worn since the first day. The guests are very pleased. I've received several compliments on the menu. Good, Martha said. Vivian's eyes moved to her, assessing, and something in the assessment sharpened slightly. Perhaps she'd heard something in Martha's voice. Perhaps she was more perceptive than she seemed. You've done competent work, Vivian said. I'll have Caleb arrange your payment in the morning. In the morning, not tonight. Martha looked at her. The arrangement was payment upon completion. And you'll be paid. In the morning. Vivian's tone had a slight edge, impatience wearing the costume of graciousness. It's my wedding evening, Mrs. Holloway. Surely financial arrangements can wait until— They can wait until morning, Martha said. That's fine. A pause. There's one other matter, Vivian said. She moved to the center of the kitchen in the way she always moved, as if the space were hers to occupy. Several guests have expressed interest in meeting the person who organized the feast. I've told them that the menu and concept were mine, which is accurate, but a few are asking specifically about the cook. She looked at Martha directly. I prefer you remain here for the remainder of the evening. I'll handle any inquiries. Martha set down the platter she was drying. She set it down very carefully. You'll handle inquiries about my cooking, she said. About the feast, yes. Vivian's voice was steady, but her chin had come up slightly. The signal, Martha had learned, of a woman preparing for pushback. That's simply how these occasions are managed, Mrs. Holloway. The host takes responsibility for— I heard what you told your guests, Martha said. The kitchen went quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a room between conversations, but a different kind. The kind that happens when something that has been approaching for a long time finally arrives. Vivian's expression didn't change, exactly, but something behind it did. I beg your pardon, she said. The pears. Martha's voice was level. She was holding on to level the way you hold onto a fence rail in wind. The pears were not your idea. Nothing on that menu was your idea. You wanted 12 courses and an ice sculpture and chocolate imported from Denver in December, and I reworked every item of your plan into something that was actually possible and actually delicious, and the result is what those 200 people just experienced. She stopped. And I heard you tell them it was your vision. Vivian stared at her. For a moment, just a moment, something genuinely human moved across her face. Something that might have been recognition, maybe even something that looked briefly like discomfort. Then it closed. You're the help, Vivian said. Her voice had gone very quiet, which was, Martha was finding, more effective than loud. You were hired to execute a job. The creative direction of this evening was mine. You cooked what I needed cooked, in my kitchen, in my husband's house, and you were compensated generously for the service. She looked at Martha with the particular look of someone who believes the hierarchy they live in is the natural order of things. I suggest you remember your position. Your position. Martha looked at her for a long moment. She was aware of Francis behind her, absolutely still. She was aware of Clara near the back wall. She was aware of the sounds from the main hall. Music now, something with a fiddle, and laughter, the laughter of people who had eaten a magnificent meal and were feeling generous with the world. She was aware of the $500 she had not yet been paid. She was aware of the 40 acres and the cottonwood and the bank letter with its 60-day window. She was aware of her own hands, which were large and calloused, and had spent 6 weeks making something extraordinary that this woman was standing in front of her claiming. I know my position, Martha said very quietly. I know it better than you think. She picked up the dishcloth. She turned back to the basin. She heard Vivian leave the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind her. Clara said softly, Mrs. Holloway. I know, Martha said. And then, from the main hall, the sound of the music stopping, and Vivian's voice raised to carry across the room, and in it a brightness that was beyond the ordinary brightness of a wedding celebration, the brightness of someone who has decided to make a moment of something. You know, Vivian's voice came through the wall, clear enough now that every word reached the kitchen. I have to tell you all something amusing about the woman I hired to cook this evening. Martha went still at the basin. She arrived with her own knives, Vivian said, and her tone had the particular quality of someone at the center of a gathering who has chosen a target she believes is safely absent. Can you imagine? A cook who brings her own knives, as if the kitchens of Wyoming couldn't supply them. She's a farm widow from Clearwater, quite a substantial woman, you'll appreciate the description, who seems to believe that her particular talent for country cooking constitutes something worth celebrating. Laughter. More laughter than before, warmer. The easy laughter of a room being led somewhere by a confident voice. She spent the entire 6 weeks convinced she was making decisions about the menu. Vivian's voice carried a smile in it, the conversational smile of someone enjoying their own performance. I had to be very patient in redirecting her more rustic instincts toward something appropriate for the occasion. Martha set down the dishcloth. She looked at the kitchen door. She thought about the $500. She thought about what it cost to be invisible, what it extracted, what it took away over time from the person doing the work of disappearing. She thought about what her mother used to say about putting good ingredients together wrong. She thought about a man with dark eyes who'd said, "I'm sorry for it," and meant it, who'd eaten test bread in the gray morning and looked at her with an expression she'd been trying not to name for 6 weeks. She picked up the kitchen door handle. "Martha," Frances said, one word, low and urgent. "I know," Martha said. She opened the door and walked into the main hall. 200 faces turned toward her. 200 faces. Martha had cooked for crowds before. She understood, in the abstract, what it meant to feed large numbers of people. But standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the main hall, looking at 200 people looking back at her, was a different thing entirely from understanding it in the abstract. The hall was lit with oil lamps and candles, warm and golden, the kind of light that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Long tables ran the length of the room, still set with the remnants of the feast, the cleared plates, the coffee cups, the wine glasses at various stages of empty. At the head table, she could see Vivian, whose expression had gone very still in the way of someone who has said something they intended as entertainment and found it traveling somewhere they didn't plan. Beside Vivian, Caleb sat with the particular stillness of a man who has heard something he cannot unhear and is deciding what to do with it. Martha stood in the doorway. She had not planned what to say. She had not, if she was honest, planned to walk through that door at all. It had been an action born of something past the reach of planning, some part of herself that had finally exceeded its own capacity for management. And now she was standing in front of 200 strangers in her apron, with flour on her sleeve and 6 weeks of kitchen work on her hands, and the room was quiet. In that particular way, rooms go quiet when they sense something real is about to happen. She looked at Vivian. Vivian looked back at her, and something moved across her face, a flash of something that might have been genuine alarm, before it settled into the careful composure she wore like armor. "Mrs. Holloway," Vivian said, with a brightness that cost her something. "We were just speaking about the evening." "I know," Martha said. "I heard." The quiet in the room deepened. Martha was aware of her own heartbeat. She was aware that she was large, that her apron was stained, that her hair had come partly loose from its pins in the heat of the kitchen, that she was standing in a room full of people dressed in their finest, presenting herself as exactly what she was. She was aware of all of it, and she did not adjust herself. She didn't square her shoulders in a deliberate way or lift her chin for effect. She just stood there, the way she stood in her own kitchen, taking up the space she actually took up. "My name is Martha Holloway," she said. Her voice carried. She hadn't intended it to carry. She wasn't shouting, but the room was very quiet and her voice had the quality of someone who had spent years projecting across kitchen noise. "I'm a cook from Clearwater. I've been at the Double T for 6 weeks preparing this evening's feast." She could hear distantly the sound of someone shifting in a chair, the tick of a cooling lamp. "The pears were my idea," she said. "The bread recipe is mine. The timing of the roast service, the spice ratios on the beef, the decision to do 8 courses instead of 12 because 12 wasn't executable, and 8 was, those were my decisions." She stopped. "I want you to know that because it's true. I'm not angry." She said the last part because she needed to say something, and it was the most neutral, true thing she could find. "I just think that when someone does a thing, they should be able to say they did it." The silence held for another moment. Then Vivian said very quietly, with a precision that was its own kind of violence, "How dare you?" The words fell into the room clearly. "You come in here, into my wedding, in that state." Vivian's composure had cracked, not entirely, but enough to show what was under it, and what was under it was something colder than anger. "Do you have any idea, any comprehension of your position here? You were paid to cook. You were a servant. That is all you were and all you are, and the idea that you would walk into this room and—" She stopped, and when she started again, her voice had recovered some of its surface control, but lost something else. "Look at you. Look at what you are. A farm widow who spent 6 weeks in someone else's kitchen and wants to be congratulated for it." She let her eyes move over Martha once, the full length of the assessment. I gave you the opportunity to do the only thing you're suited for. You should be grateful. The room was very, very quiet now. Martha stood in it and let the words land. She didn't move away from them. She felt them the way you feel a particular kind of cold, not comfortable, but clarifying. She was about to speak when a chair scraped back from the head table. Caleb stood up. He didn't say anything immediately. He pushed his chair back and he stood up, and the room, all 200 people in it, shifted its attention to him with the particular attentiveness of a crowd that understands it is witnessing something consequential. He looked at Martha first, just for a moment, his eyes on her face, not assessing her, not measuring anything, just looking at her the way he'd looked at her across the kitchen every morning for 6 weeks, with the direct attention of someone who sees what's actually in front of them. Then he looked at Vivian. "Vivian," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Don't." "Caleb, don't," he said again. Still quiet. Not angry, exactly. Something past anger. Something that had moved through anger and arrived somewhere with more gravity. "Don't stand in my house and talk to a woman like that." Vivian's color had risen. "She walked into our wedding celebration, and she said her name," Caleb said. "She said her name and what she made. In 6 weeks, I don't think anyone at this table asked her either one of those things." He looked at the table, at the guests, the Ashford family, the business associates and relatives who had eaten Martha's food and listened to Vivian claim it. "Mrs. Holloway has been in my kitchen since before 4 every morning, making something that every person in this room called extraordinary tonight. She rebuilt Vivian's menu from the ground up, because what was on paper wasn't something any kitchen could execute. She worked 16-hour days and she never complained once, not to me, and I was there to see it." Edmund Ashford, Vivian's father, the man Martha had heard arguing with Caleb in the hallway, said from somewhere down the table, "Caleb, this is neither the time nor—" "It's exactly the time," Caleb said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You want to talk about time, Edmund? We've spent 6 weeks here talking around things that needed to be said directly. I'm done talking around them." He looked at Vivian. Something passed between them. Not affection, Martha thought, watching. Not even anger. Something more like the recognition of two people who have been pretending an arrangement was something it wasn't and have simultaneously stopped pretending. "I can't do this," he said. Still quiet. Still with that steadiness that was neither cruelty nor performance. "I should have said it months ago. I should have said it before I hired a cook and sent invitations and let this go so far that 200 people drove here in December." He looked at the table briefly, as if the breadth of the situation was landing on him with its full weight. "I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for the distance everyone traveled. I'm genuinely sorry for it." He looked at Vivian again. "But I'm not going to marry someone who stands in my house and talks to a hardworking woman like she's something stuck to the bottom of a boot. I'm not built for it. I tried to be practical about what this was. But I'm not going to do this." The silence that followed was of a completely different quality than any of the silences that had preceded it. Vivian stood very still. Her face had gone through several things rapidly. Shock, fury, something that might briefly have been hurt, and then a cold composure that settled over everything like frost. She was not a woman who fell apart publicly. Whatever she felt, she would feel it somewhere else, later, where no one was watching. "You're making a spectacle," she said, low and precise. "I know," Caleb said. "I'm sorry for that too." Edmund Ashford was on his feet now. "Thornton, I want to be very clear that the land agreement is not signed," Caleb said, "and won't be. That land was my grandfather's and my father's, and it's mine. I should have been clear about that from the beginning. I kept thinking the other parts of the arrangement might make the land part easier to live with." He looked at Edmund steadily. "They don't. You understand what you're walking away from." "I understand what I'm keeping," Caleb said. The room erupted. Not violently. These were not violent people. But in the way rooms erupt when something that has been held in suspension is suddenly released. Voices from every direction, the Ashford relatives moving toward Edmund, the Wyoming families leaning toward each other, the particular chaos of a social event whose structure has just been removed from underneath it. Martha stood in the doorway and watched it and felt strange, unmoored. She had walked through that door without knowing what would happen, and what had happened was nothing she could have planned for. She felt the particular vertiginous quality of a moment you'll spend years thinking about, the sense of time moving both too fast and not at all. Vivian turned from Caleb, and her eyes found Martha across the room. And what was in them, what Martha saw in Vivian Ashford's eyes in that moment, was something she hadn't expected. Not just fury, though the fury was there, something underneath the fury that was rawer than that, a pain that was real, even if the ways she'd expressed it over 6 weeks had been genuinely unkind. The collapse of something she'd wanted, whatever her reasons for wanting it, and the particular humiliation of that collapse happening in public, in front of everyone she'd brought here to witness her triumph. Martha had no warm feeling toward Vivian. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But she recognized what she was seeing in those eyes, because she'd felt versions of it herself. The specific anguish of losing something in front of people who would remember the losing. Vivian looked at her for one long, unguarded moment. Then she turned and walked out of the main hall through the far door, and her mother followed her and 2 of her sisters, and the careful procession of it had a dignity that Martha found she could respect even now. In the chaos that remained, people moving and talking and the whole fragile architecture of the evening visibly dismantling, Martha became aware that Caleb was walking toward her. He crossed the room with the focused directness of someone who has decided where they're going and is not looking at anything else. He reached the doorway where she stood and stopped in front of her, close enough that the noise of the room receded slightly. "Are you all right?" he said. She looked at him. "Are you?" He almost laughed. There was nothing funny about any of it, but the almost laugh was real. "No," he said. "Not exactly. You just called off your wedding in front of 200 people. "I did," he agreed. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of a man who regrets something. The tiredness of a man who has been carrying a weight longer than he should have and has just set it down and is feeling the absence of it in his arms. "I should have done it months ago." "You said that," she said. "Inside. It's true twice." They stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, and around them the evening moved into its new, unplanned shape. Martha was aware of Francis watching from the kitchen, of guests moving past them with the careful extra distance of people giving a moment its privacy. "I owe you an apology," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Not for tonight," he said. "For the 6 weeks before it. For the kitchen door and the dark dresses and—" He stopped. "I knew what was happening. I made myself not look at it directly because I was trying to keep things manageable. That was a coward's approach, and it cost you something, and I'm sorry." Martha thought about how she'd filed things away for 6 weeks. The accumulation of small unkindnesses, the daily work of making herself invisible, the $500 that had been the weight on the other side of the scale. "You came in at 4:30 every morning," she said. "You asked real questions and you listened to the answers. You said you were sorry about the kitchen door on the first day." She looked at him steadily. "That counts. It's not enough." "No," she agreed. "It isn't, but it counts." From across the room, Edmund Ashford's voice rose above the general noise, something about agreements and legal instruments and obligations, and Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "I need to go manage this," he said. "I know." He didn't move immediately. He stood in the doorway looking at her with the direct attention she'd learned to recognize as specifically his, the attention that didn't calculate or perform, that simply looked. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer it honestly." "I usually do," she said. "When you walk through that door tonight—" He paused. "What were you going to say? Before it went the way it went? What did you mean to say?" She thought about it. "That I made the food. That my name is Martha Holloway, and I'm from Clearwater, and I made the food, and it was the best food I've ever made, and someone in that room should know that." "That's all?" "That was everything," she said. "That was the whole of it." He looked at her for a moment longer. "Martha Holloway," he said, the way he'd said her first name once before in the kitchen, with that quality of deliberateness, as if the name itself was something worth the care of saying correctly. "You made something extraordinary tonight. Every person in that room knows it, even the ones who didn't know your name." She felt something in her chest move, some long-held thing shifting. She was not going to cry. She was too tired and too practical for that, but the shift happened, and she felt it happen, and she didn't try to file it away. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back into the room. She watched him cross toward Edmund Ashford with the particular walk of a man on his own land going to deal with something he'd rather not deal with, and she turned back into the kitchen. Frances was there. Clara was there. Robert was by the back wall, forgotten in the drama, still holding an empty coffee tray. "Well," Frances said. "Well," Martha agreed. "He canceled the wedding." "He did?" "Because of you," Frances said. "Because of himself," Martha said. She stopped. "I just walked through a door." Frances looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the stove. "The coffee urn needs to be refilled," she said. "There are still people out there, and they're going to want something warm to hold while they sort out what just happened." "Yes," Martha said. "They will." She moved to the coffee. The next hour was unlike any service Martha had managed. The formal structure of the evening was gone, replaced by something informal and slightly stunned. People gathering in smaller groups. The wedding party dissolved into its constituent parts. Martha kept the coffee going. She brought out the last of the bread she'd held back and sliced it and put it on a board and sent Robert out with it because bread was what you gave people when the situation exceeded the food that had been planned for it. She heard in pieces carried back by Robert and filtered through the sounds from the hall what was happening out there. Edmund Ashford demanding a formal accounting of the land arrangement. 2 of the Wyoming ranchers apparently intervening on Caleb's behalf. Men who'd known his father, men who had opinions about the Ashford family's southeastern land ambitions that predated this evening. Vivian's mother reappearing to collect her daughters and their luggage and departing the ranch before 8 o'clock with a speed that suggested the departure had been prepared for. Not planned, Eugenia Ashford had not anticipated needing to leave early on the night of her daughter's wedding, but executed with the efficiency of a woman who had spent her life managing the retreat from unfavorable positions. Around 9 o'clock, the guests began to leave in earnest. Martha could hear the sounds of departure, carriages being brought around, voices calling goodnights, the horses. The ranch hands who had spent the evening managing the stable and guest horses were suddenly very busy. The man from Laramie, the large man who had stood up to look at the roast platter, stopped in the kitchen doorway on his way out. He was maybe 60, with a broad, honest face and the look of someone who had made his money by understanding what things were actually worth. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. She looked up from where she was working. "I want you to know," he said, "that is the finest meal I have eaten in 20 years, and I have eaten in Denver and Chicago and once in New York." He looked at her without the assessing quality that most people's looks carried. "If you ever want work, real work, catering for serious occasions, I host 3 large events each year at my ranch in Laramie. My wife has been looking for someone who can cook like that." He pulled a card from his pocket and set it on the edge of the preparation table. "That's my name and address, no obligation, but I wanted you to have it." He left before she could respond fully. She picked up the card. "Thomas Aldridge," it read. "Aldridge Ranch, Laramie County." She set it in her apron pocket. By 10 o'clock, the ranch was quiet in the way that large places go quiet after something large has ended. A heavy, textured quiet, full of the residue of what had happened. The guests were gone or settled in the bunkhouse that had been prepared for those staying overnight. The kitchen was nearly clean. Frances had gone home. Clara had gone home. Robert had put away the last of the serving equipment and said goodnight with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. Martha sat at the preparation table alone. She was very tired. The kind of tired that sat in her bones rather than just her muscles. The particular exhaustion of a day that had required everything from her in multiple directions simultaneously. On the table in front of her was Thomas Aldridge's card, her timing charts from the morning, a cup of coffee that was going cold. She was thinking about the 40 acres, about the bank letter, about $500 she still hadn't been paid, and whether, in the chaos of the evening, she was going to have to ask for it, whether it would be awkward to ask for it, whether Caleb would remember, whether she would have to find some tactful way to raise the subject of money on the night the man's wedding had fallen apart. She was still thinking about it when Caleb came into the kitchen. He looked like the evening had cost him what it had cost him. He was carrying his jacket over one arm, his collar loosened, and he had the look of a man who has been managing the fallout of a large decision for 3 hours and is past the point where appearance matters much. He saw her at the table and stopped. "You're still here," he said. "I'm still here," she said. "I need to speak with you about the payment." Something moved across his face, something between relief and a kind of appreciation for the directness. "Of course," he said. He set his jacket over a chair and moved to the counter, not the coffee. The coffee was cold and she hadn't made fresh, and he seemed to know it. He stood at the counter and looked at her. $500. I'll write you a bank draft tonight." "Tonight is fine," she said. "I'll get the book." He didn't move immediately. He stood at the counter looking at her with an expression that had too many things in it to name easily. "How are you?" "Tired," she said. "And—" she stopped. "I don't know what I am exactly. Tonight was not what I planned when I walked through that door." "No," he said. "For either of us." A pause. "Was it the right thing?" she asked. She wasn't sure why she was asking him this. It wasn't her business. She'd told herself that before. He was quiet for a moment. "Stopping the wedding." "All of it." He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about things, not reaching for the comfortable answer, but looking at the actual question. "I don't know if it was right," he said. "I know it was true. I couldn't have stood up in that room and listened to her speak to you that way and stayed in my seat. I couldn't have done it and then spent the rest of my life in this house." He looked at the kitchen, at the walls and the range and the copper pots on their hooks. "This is my father's house. It's going to be my house for the rest of my life. I can't have it be the kind of house where a woman who works like you work gets talked about the way she talked about you." Martha looked at him. "That's a principled reason to cancel a wedding," she said. "It's the only one I had that I could say out loud," he said. And then, quietly, "There were others I couldn't." The kitchen was very quiet. Martha looked at the cold coffee in her cup. She looked at Thomas Aldridge's card on the table. She looked at her hands, which were telling their usual story of work and time. "I'm going home tomorrow," she said. "I know. The farm needs—" She stopped. "There's always something that needs." "There is," he agreed. "Always." Another pause, this one different from the ones before it, less weighted, somehow, less freighted with what couldn't be said, as if some of the pressure had released. "I'll get the bank draft," he said. "Thank you." He went to the study off the hallway. She heard a drawer open, the scratch of a pen. He came back with a folded paper and set it on the table in front of her. She picked it up. $500, written in his plain, even hand. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket, next to Thomas Aldridge's card. "The bread you made this morning," Caleb said. He was still standing by the table, his jacket over his arm, going nowhere quite yet. "The test loaf. I've been thinking about it all day." She looked up at him. "I think," he said slowly, "that it might be the best thing I've ever eaten, and I've been trying to figure out why, because I've had good bread before. But there was something about that particular loaf on that particular morning that was different." Martha thought about the bread, the high altitude, the Laramie flour, the extra time she'd given the dough, the morning light, the fact that she'd made it partly by feel rather than measurement because she'd been too tired to measure carefully and had trusted her hands instead. "Sometimes," she said, "the best things come out of the mornings when you're not trying to be impressive. You're just trying to get it right." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I think that's exactly it." He said good night and went to bed, and Martha sat alone in the kitchen for a little while longer, with the draft in her pocket and the quiet of the ranch around her, and the residue of the strangest day of her recent life settling into something she didn't yet have words for. Outside, the Wyoming night was the same as it had always been, enormous and cold and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out below it. The stars didn't care what had happened in the main hall. The mountains to the west had not registered Vivian Ashford's departure, or Edmund Ashford's fury, or 200 people eating the best pears they'd ever tasted in their lives. But Martha was sitting at the table in a warm kitchen with $500 in her pocket, and the beginning of something she couldn't name yet but could feel, the way you can feel spring coming in late February when there's still snow on the ground. Not here yet, but unmistakable, and coming. She finished her cold coffee and went to bed. She left the double tea the next morning before 8. Caleb was already out with the horses when she came downstairs with her trunk and her carpet bag and her box of knives. The ranch was quiet in the particular way of the morning after something large, a silence that was still processing, still absorbing what had happened within it. A few ranch hands moved across the yard at a distance, careful with their eyes, the way people are when they know they witnessed something consequential and aren't sure of the etiquette around it yet. Hector brought her wagon around without being asked. He loaded her trunk with the same quiet efficiency he'd used to unload it 6 weeks earlier. And when he was done, he stood by the horse and held the bridle and looked at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and had mostly succeeded. "It was the best meal I've had since my grandmother died," he said. "And she was from Oaxaca, so that's not a small thing." Martha looked at him. "Thank you, Hector." "Yes, ma'am." She was settling herself on the wagon seat when she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her. She knew the sound of them by now. Caleb came around the side of the wagon and stopped. He was in his work clothes, the same ones he wore every morning at 4:30, not the clothes of a man who had been a groom the night before. He looked like himself. That was the thing she noticed first. He looked more like himself than he had at any point during the previous 6 weeks. "You're not going to wait for breakfast," he said. "I need to get home," she said. "The road's better in the early cold before the afternoon mud." He nodded. That was true, and he knew it. He put one hand on the wagon side, not stopping her, just present. "I want you to know something," he said, "before you go." She waited. "What you did last night, walking through that door, that took more courage than anything I saw in that room all evening, including what I did." He looked at her directly. "What I did was easier. I had the position, I had the name and the land and the room full of people who had to listen to me whether they wanted to or not. You walked in there with nothing except the truth. That's harder." Martha looked at him for a moment. "It wasn't courage," she said. "It was 6 weeks of accumulated frustration finally exceeding my self-control." He almost smiled. Almost. "Sometimes those are the same thing." She picked up the reins. She needed to go. She knew that if she sat here long enough, something would be said that neither of them was ready to say. And the morning was cold, and the road was waiting, and she had 40 acres in Clearwater with a leaking east roof and a sticking barn door, and $412 to pay to Gerald Pruitt at the First Wyoming Territorial Bank. "Thank you for the work," she said, "and for the mornings." "The mornings were the best part of the 6 weeks," he said, simply, directly, without decoration. She looked at him one more time. Then she clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved, and she drove out of the Double T without looking back, because looking back was not something she allowed herself when she was trying to hold her composure, and composure was what she had left. The road home took 4 hours. The sky was the pale winter blue of a Wyoming December, cloudless, the kind of day that looked warmer than it was. She drove through it with her coat buttoned to the throat and her mind doing what minds do after large events, returning to the same moments over and over, examining them from different angles, finding new details in the replay. She thought about Vivian's face in the doorway of the kitchen on the first day, the quick assessing look that had categorized and filed. She thought about 6 weeks of dark doorways and quiet instructions delivered through Penny, each one individually manageable and collectively something else. She thought about the way the main hall had gone silent when she walked through that door, 200 faces turning, and how she'd felt. Not brave, nothing so clean as brave. Terrified, actually. Her heart going very fast, her hands not entirely steady, standing in her apron in front of strangers because she'd reached the end of what she could absorb quietly. She thought about Caleb saying, "I'm sorry for it" on the very first morning, how simple that had been, and how rare. She thought about the bread, the test loaf in the gray morning. Sometimes the best things come out of the mornings when you're not trying to be impressive. She'd meant it about cooking, but somewhere in the 4 hours of driving, it occurred to her that she'd meant it about more than cooking. She got home in the early afternoon, and the farm was exactly as she'd left it. The same leaking east roof, the same sticking barn door, the same 40 acres going gray and dormant under the December sky. The cottonwood by the creek had lost the last of its leaves. She could see it from the lane, the bare gray branches against the pale sky. She unhitched the horse, got her things inside, and then she sat down at the kitchen table and took out the bank draft and Thomas Aldridge's card and set them both on the table in front of her, $500. She wrote the check to Gerald Pruitt at the First Wyoming Territorial Bank that same afternoon and rode into Clearwater to post it. She stood at the postal window and handed it across, and felt the particular lightness of a weight that has been carried long enough to become invisible until it's gone. The farm was hers. The 40 acres, the cottonwood, the sticking barn door. Hers, without the shadow of the bank letter over them. She rode home in the early dark and made herself supper and went to bed and slept for 10 hours, which was the first time she'd slept that long in 6 weeks. Bess Cartwright came by the next morning. She sat at Martha's kitchen table with her coffee, and she listened to the whole account with the attentiveness of a woman who had been waiting for it, and when Martha finished, Bess was quiet for a moment. "He canceled the wedding," she said, "in front of everyone, because of what she said to you." "Because of what she said to me," Martha agreed, "and because of the land, and because he'd been pretending the arrangement was something it wasn't for long enough that it had become untenable." She turned her coffee cup. "It wasn't just me. But you walking through that door was what broke it open." Martha thought about that. "I suppose it was." Bess looked at her with the sharp eyes that missed almost nothing. "And? And what?" "Martha." "Bess." "The man canceled his wedding," Bess said. "What are you going to do about it?" Martha set down her cup. "I'm going to fix the east roof," she said, "and write to Thomas Aldridge and Laramie about the catering work, and replant the kitchen garden in the spring." She looked at Bess. "I'm going to do what I always do. I'm going to work." Bess considered this. "That's not an answer to what I asked." "I know," Martha said. She wrote to Thomas Aldridge that week. The reply came quickly. His wife, Eleanor, wrote back in a warm and specific hand, describing 3 events they hosted annually and the kind of cooking they were looking for, and asking if Martha would come to Laramie in February to discuss the arrangement in person. The fee she named for each event made Martha read the paragraph twice. She wrote back and said yes. Over the following weeks, other letters arrived. She hadn't expected them. She hadn't known the word would travel, didn't know exactly which guest had spoken to whom, but it traveled the way things travel in territories where word of mouth is the primary currency. A family in Cheyenne planning a spring celebration. A hotel in Casper asking if she did extended contracts. A woman in Buffalo whose daughter was marrying in June and who wrote 6 paragraphs about the pairs before getting to the point. Martha sat at her kitchen table with the letters spread in front of her and felt something she didn't entirely have a name for. Not triumph. It wasn't clean enough for triumph. Something more complicated than that. Something that included the awareness of how long she'd been doing work this good in rooms where no one would say her name, and the particular strange quality of the world suddenly, belatedly, deciding to notice. She answered every letter. She was selective about what she took on. She was 43 years old and she had a farm to maintain, and she was not going to run herself into the ground for any amount of flattering correspondence. She heard from Bess that the Ashford family had returned to Philadelphia within a week of the wedding that hadn't happened. She heard that Edmund Ashford had engaged a lawyer regarding the land question, and that Caleb had engaged one too, and that the lawyer Caleb engaged was apparently better, because nothing further had come of it. The Double T land stayed what it was. She did not hear from Caleb directly. She hadn't expected to. Whatever had been between them in those morning hours was real. She didn't lie to herself about that. But real wasn't the same as ready. Real wasn't the same as simple. He had just dismantled his life in a fairly spectacular public fashion, and she had a farm and a new professional reputation and 40 acres that were finally, securely hers. Some things needed to find their own time. January passed. The east roof got patched, not perfectly but adequately, by a carpenter from Clearwater who charged fairly and worked efficiently. The barn door got fixed. The kitchen garden she planned carefully on paper through the cold months, mapping what she wanted to grow and where, incorporating things she needed for the cooking work. The specialized herbs, the particular varieties of root vegetables that weren't easy to source in Wyoming and that she was tired of doing without. She went to Laramie in February and met Eleanor Aldridge, who was a direct, capable woman with good taste and no tolerance for pretension, and they liked each other immediately in the practical way that people who respect competence tend to like each other. Thomas Aldridge shook her hand at the end of the meeting and said, "We'll need you for March, May, and October." And Martha said, "Send me the dates." And that was the professional arrangement established. On the drive back from Laramie, on a road that cut through high country where the winter was still fully present and the peaks to the west were white against a hard blue sky. Martha thought about what her life looked like now compared to what it had looked like when she'd stood at her kitchen window in November reading a bank letter. It was not a transformed life. It was not unrecognizable. She was still a large woman driving alone through Wyoming in February, still tired in her hands and her feet, still carrying the particular loneliness of someone who has lost people and learned to live with the loss. She was still imperfect in the ways she'd always been imperfect, too direct sometimes, too stubborn about food, prone to taking on more than she could comfortably carry and then managing it anyway through sheer refusal to admit she'd overcommitted. But the farm was hers. The work was real. And it was hers too. Not hidden, not performed in someone else's name, but hers. People in 3 counties knew her name and could attach it to something extraordinary she had made with her own hands. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. She was thinking about this, the size and shape of what quite a lot actually meant, when she got back to Clearwater in the late afternoon and found a horse she recognized tied at her gate. She sat in the wagon and looked at the horse for a moment. Then she climbed down and tied her own horse and walked up the path to the porch. Caleb was sitting on the porch step. He was in his ordinary clothes, his hat in his hands, looking at the dormant kitchen garden with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting long enough to start observing the details of where they're waiting. He looked up when he heard her on the path. "I should have written first," he said. "I thought about writing. Then I thought, I've spent enough time over the past few months on words that were easier than the real thing. So I drove." Martha looked at him. He looked the same as he had every morning at 4:30, like himself, without ornamentation. There were lines around his eyes that she didn't think came from age, so much as from the past 2 months of whatever managing the fallout of December 14th looked like from the inside. "How long have you been sitting on my step?" she asked. "About an hour." "In February?" "It's not that cold," he said, which was objectively untrue. She went up the steps past him and unlocked the door. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came inside. He sat at her kitchen table the way he'd sat at his own, with the ease of someone who doesn't require the comforts of a formal room. He looked at the kitchen, at the organized counters and the hanging bunches of dried herbs and the stack of letters and correspondence on the far end of the table, with the interested attention she recognized. "You've been busy," he said. "The Aldridge family in Laramie, and others." She put the coffee on. "The word from December 14th traveled." "I heard," he said. "Robert told me the man from Laramie stood up to look at the roast platter." "He did." "That doesn't surprise me." She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. "Why are you here, Caleb?" He held his hat in his hands and looked at her with the directness that she'd come to understand as one of his core qualities. Not rudeness, not performance. Just the willingness to look at things straight on. "Because I've been trying to figure out the right time to come," he said. "And then I realized that waiting for the right time was the same thing I did with the wedding, and with the land papers, and with half a dozen other things in the past few years. I kept waiting for things to be uncomplicated before I addressed them." He paused. "Things don't get uncomplicated on their own. I've noticed that." "No," Martha said. "They don't." "I owe you something I haven't said properly," he said. "Not an apology. I've apologized and I meant it. Something else." He turned his hat once in his hands. Those mornings in the kitchen, the 6 weeks of them. They were the realest conversations I'd had in a very long time. Maybe the realest I'd had since my father died. And I knew it while it was happening, and I didn't. I kept it in the morning hours, and then I went out and managed everything else, and told myself the rest of it was just practicality. He looked at her steadily. It wasn't practicality. It was me not looking at something I wasn't ready to look at. Martha poured the coffee. She set a cup in front of him and took her chair across the table. Her chair, in her kitchen, on her farm, on her 40 acres. She sat in it with the solidness of someone in exactly the place they belong. "What are you looking at now?" she asked. "You," he said, plainly. "I'm looking at you, and I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me come here again, not to declare anything or make promises that are premature, just to continue the conversation, the one we started in my kitchen at 4:30 in the morning." Martha looked at him. She thought about what it had cost her to walk through that door in December. Not just the risk of it, the $500, the public spectacle, the vulnerability of saying my name is Martha Holloway and I made this thing in front of strangers. But the cost of what came before it. 6 weeks of making herself smaller. Years, if she was honest, of a life that had been good but had required her to stay mostly invisible in it, to do her best work in the back rooms of other people's occasions. She thought about what it would mean to let someone see her. Not the cook, not the capable woman from Clearwater, not the large widow who was useful for large events. Her. The whole complicated, imperfect, stubborn, talented, still grieving, genuinely hopeful reality of her. It was not a small thing to ask for. It was not a small thing to give. You'd have to understand something, she said. Tell me. I'm not going to make myself small for anyone again, she said. Not for a room full of guests. Not for a business arrangement. Not for anything. I'm 43 years old and I've spent enough of my life managing how much space I take up. She held his gaze. I'm not easy. I have opinions about food that are frankly non-negotiable. I work long hours and I'm not always pleasant at the end of them. I'm attached to this farm in ways that are probably not entirely rational. And I spent 4 years learning to live alone after Daniel died, and I'm not sure what I am, exactly, about any of this. I'm not sure what I want. That's honest, he said. It's the only way I know how to be. I know, he said. It's one of the things... He stopped, started again. It's one of the things that made those mornings what they were. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the February afternoon was going gray at the edges, the early dark of a winter day coming down over the 40 acres. The cottonwood by the creek was visible through the kitchen window, still bare, the same gray bones against the same gray sky. Martha looked at the man sitting across her kitchen table. He was not perfect. She knew that. She'd had 6 weeks to observe the imperfections, the tendency toward avoidance when things got complicated, the way he'd let the wrong arrangements go on too long because confrontation was harder than enduring. He was going to have to live with what happened in December for a long time, in a community where people had long memories and opinions about public spectacles. Neither was she perfect. That was also established. But he had come to her porch in February and sat on the step for an hour in the cold rather than write a careful letter, and that was, she thought, the kind of evidence that mattered. Come back on Saturday, she said. I'm cooking, if you want to eat. Something in his face changed, a lightening, careful but real. What are you making? I don't know yet, she said. I'll figure it out. He came back on Saturday. And the Saturday after that. By spring, the east roof was holding. The kitchen garden was planted. The specialized herbs, the particular root vegetables, the things she needed for her own purposes now. The Aldridge event in March had been, by every account she received, extraordinary. Eleanor Aldridge had written to say that 3 of the guests had asked for Martha's contact information and that she hoped the October booking was still firm because she'd already told people about it. It was still firm. In June, Caleb helped her rebuild the west fence, which had been something she'd been managing around for 2 years without admitting how much it needed proper attention. He was not, it turned out, a man who helped with things and then felt ownership of them. He helped because the fence needed doing and he was there, and that was the extent of it. She cooked dinner and they ate it at her kitchen table with the June evening coming through the open door, and it was not a dramatic evening. It was ordinary in the specific way that only the right things can be ordinary, easy, unguarded, real. She thought about what her mother had said, about ingredients put together wrong, about how you could do that and never nourish anyone. Some things put together right took time to show what they were. That was the other half of the lesson, the part she'd been figuring out over the years. Not just that wrong arrangements fail, but that right ones unfold slowly, and you have to be patient with them and honest about what you're looking at, and you have to resist the pull toward conclusions before the thing has had time to become itself. They were married in October, in a ceremony small enough that the word ceremony was almost an overstatement. Bess and her sister, Hector from the Double T, Robert, who had carried plates through the most consequential dinner service in Laramie County history, Thomas and Eleanor Aldridge, who had driven from Laramie and seemed genuinely pleased about the whole thing. Frances brought a cake that was technically a wedding cake, but looked, more accurately, like something made by a good friend who had strong opinions about cake and didn't feel constrained by convention. It was imperfect. The October weather turned cold midway through the afternoon, and everyone had to move inside earlier than planned, and Bess's sister told the same story 3 times without appearing to notice, and Martha burned the rolls slightly. Not badly, not inedibly, but enough that she knew, and it bothered her in the specific way that small culinary failures bothered her, even on days when there were larger things to think about. She was in the kitchen dealing with the rolls when Caleb appeared behind her. "They're fine," he said. "The bottom is dark." "Martha, it's our wedding." She looked at the rolls, she looked at him. She set down the pan. "You're right," she said. "I'm occasionally right," he said. "I find it's best to acknowledge it when it happens." She laughed, the real kind, not the polite kind, and went back to the table where the people who actually cared about them were waiting. And that was the best thing about the day. Not the ceremony, not the cake, not even the food, which was otherwise excellent. The best thing was that the people in the room were people who knew her, who had seen her work and known her name from the beginning, who had never once required her to be invisible. The double T and the Clearwater farm became what they became. A life that moved between 2 places. A marriage between 2 people who had each learned, the hard way and over time, the difference between arrangements built on practicality and ones built on truth. It was not without difficulty. He was still prone to avoidance when things got complicated. She was still too stubborn about the food and about other things, and she knew it. But difficult and right were not mutually exclusive. She'd always known that about cooking. It turned out to be true about most things that mattered. By the following year, Martha Holloway, she kept the name professionally, it was the name people in 4 counties now associated with the best food they'd ever eaten, was the most sought-after cook in the Wyoming Territory for events of consequence. She had turned down more work than she'd accepted. She had opinions about which jobs deserved her time, and she exercised them without apology. People asked her sometimes how she'd built the reputation, what the secret was. She always said the same thing. She'd just cooked the food as well as she could, and then said her name out loud. That was all. The woman who had spent 6 weeks behind a kitchen door, invisible by instruction, became someone people traveled to find. Not because the world had changed in any dramatic way, and not because anything had been given to her, but because she had walked through a door one December evening in her stained apron with flour on her sleeve and said, "My name is Martha Holloway, and I made this." That was the whole of it. That was enough.